So yeah, my name is Laura, and I'm one of the co-founders of Tally Workspace. In terms of background, my background's actually finance. So I am a chartered accountant by background, and started my career really boring in the Big Four, and then started doing accountancy for startups. So I originally was an outsourced finance person for startups, and then I went in-house and worked at a startup called Florence. And I guess how Tally came about was me and my co-founder Jules. We are actually friends from university, and we just had lots of, I would say, terrible startup ideas over the years. And this was kind of like the first one where, when we started speaking to people, they were like, "Oh yeah, I would use that." So we kind of built a website on Squarespace and actually just like started doing it. So yeah, that was kind of how it came about. And it's changed a lot. Like when we started, it was during COVID, and it was all about booking hot desks near home. As people started going back to the office, it started being about booking offices for everyone to meet up. And now 80% of our revenue is selling full-time offices. So we've, yeah, been on quite a journey.
Awesome. Thank you, Laura. Would love to understand, you mentioned you worked with a bunch of startups and then you were at a startup. How did that influence how you kind of framed approaching pitching for Tally?
I think it was good in that I knew the expectations of like what the finance model should look like. And I'd been in all of those pitch meetings. But I would actually say, when I look back on it, the questions that I think it meant I did well on were the ones that demonstrated that I knew what I was getting myself into. So it was kind of, in startups, I would say it's a bit of a roller coaster. So, like, if you've done it before, you know that you're going to have to fire people. And honestly, some of the investors would say, like, "How many people have you fired?" That was like a question that we got. Um, and being a bit like not shaken by quite difficult questions like that, I think was actually quite helpful. Um,
Awesome. And, you know, starting from zero and crafting a narrative from scratch can be pretty overwhelming. So would just love to hear, how you did that with Tally, and then also just what's the best place for founders to start when they're doing that.
so I think I have a bad habit for overcomplicating things. And my co-founder Jules is very good at making things very like simplistic. So we had like really detailed financial model and all of this stuff backing it up. But I think when we first went into pitches, people just want to, how they say like, "Oh, can you do your finances on a napkin?" It's that kind of thing they want to be. I remember one of the angels that we spoke to was talking about another investment that he made, and he was saying they'd already pre-sold three of these products. The products were worth 300K, so they only needed to sell five and my investment would be fine. So it's kind of like that level of basicness that people want to be able to like look at it and understand that it's going to make money. And I think it's quite easy when you're building it to really go into the weeds, but actually it's how to bring it up and simplify it is the really important bit.
Awesome. I think that's a good segue into our next question of when you were kind of starting, it sounds like, obviously you're more numbers oriented, but how did you start with kind of like the numbers and then craft the pitch around it, or did you start with the pitch and then kind of bring in some facts and figures to back it up?
So I was looking back at our investor deck pre this, and it was actually quite interesting because it's not how I remembered it being. Um, and so we had a long bit about the narrative at the start. I think it's like 6 slides of narrative before it goes into the finances and traction and everything else. Um, and I would make that way shorter now. I think you need like a high level, why us, why now, and what are we doing? But I think we went too detailed into that. Um, I think you do need the story vaguely first, because you don't care about the finances if you you don't know what this thing is doing. But I think ours was too detailed.
And how did you clearly communicate Tally's value proposition in a crowded space like prop tech?
Yeah. It was interesting because it was so crowded. And I don't think we even realized how crowded it was until we started speaking to investors, because there were, competitors that didn't even have websites set up either. So, you know, it was more crowded than we realized. So I think for us, the thing that swung it was definitely like traction, the fact that we had like actually sold companies, that we had done something, and it wasn't just kind of like a theory or an idea. So I think that was probably the thing that swung it for us when I look back on it.
And you had those traction points. How did you show investors that it was like repeatable, scalable, and defensible?
Um, for us, because we're kind of an aggregator of lots of workspace, I think a lot of it is about, you know, we were kind of saying we would onboard hot desks near people. So a company would come on board and we would onboard in locations near to everyone's homes, which made it quite defensible because our competitors wouldn't have like the same locations as us. So that was kind of how we started it right at the beginning. Um, I think it was all wrong in hindsight. Like, I think even if you covered the whole world as a hot desk booking platform, it would still be quite hard to make a decent amount of money. But I think we had a good argument and we had good logic to follow that, even though it may not have been true in the end. Um,
And is there something from your experience with pitching to investors that you learned that investors really care about in your initial pitches?
yeah, I think they all care about something slightly different. And I think you will often see that with competitors. So when they bring up a competitor, they'll just focus on one. And they'll really like dig into like why are you different from a specific competitor. And then you really think that you've nailed that and you can really do that argument. And the next investor will pick a completely different competitor. But I think as long as what we got advised, which I think is good advice, is every time you do a pitch, you write down every single question, which is obviously much easier with AI these days. You write down every single question that they ask, and then you have that as kind of a crib sheet and you write good answers to what you wish you had said. And by the time that you've done a couple of those, you have such a long list of questions that most things are covered and you seem prepared and you seem like you know what you're talking about. So yeah. Sorry, I feel like I've gone slightly off what the original question was.
No, that's great. And like you mentioned, you're capturing all the data from the different investors you were talking to. Did you then use that to tailor your pitch if you're talking to an angel or a VC or a certain type of investor?
We didn't. And I think you kind of have a bit of a choice to make on whether you do that strategically, because if you are changing your pitch depending on who you're pitching to, then you are probably changing what you're planning on doing to a degree. Whereas if you are really like, I think this is the size of my market and I think this is how big we are going to be, then like if that's really what you believe, then you wouldn't be changing it per investor. But I would say that it like definitely by not changing it, you are going to rule out cohorts of people. Like I don't necessarily think that we were like the size of our market is big enough for like a venture backed company. So when we spoke to those type of investors, they would be like, I would take your forecast and I'd take 50% of it off to come to what I actually think your numbers are going to be. If we had gone back as a result of that and then doubled all of our numbers, we wouldn't have got the investors that we ended up getting because they liked the fact that our forecast was really realistic. It was really clear how we were going to do what we said we were going to do. So I think you can kind of change it around to meet different people, but you might lose the people that are most suited to you, if that makes sense. And another example actually of that is we got offered money from a eco fund because at the time it was work near home, so there was kind of like a bit of an eco element to it. Obviously our product has completely evolved to like selling offices, and if we had taken that fund, then we probably couldn't have pivoted in the way that we have. So I think we kind of looked at it and we were like, you know what, it's not central. Like this eco element, I wish it was, but it like reality was it wasn't. And I think if we hadn't been like kind of true to ourselves, we might have ended up in quite a difficult position, to be honest.
Yeah, and maybe just a follow-up on that, and then we can get back to the focus on the narrative. But how did you, when you were starting out with your co-founder, kind of think about the investors you were approaching, and then how did that change and grow while you met more people?
I think at the beginning, we really went for the ones that were like well advertised and had, like submit your pitch deck on this website type thing. And they tended to be those bigger VC type pitches. Um, and then as time went on and we spoke to other founders and we kind of like learned more about, this is kind of the level that this is where we think we're going to end up and this is the level of investor, it did kind of change who we pitched to. So we went more to kind of like angels and family office type investors. Yeah.
Awesome. And what advice do you have for founders on structuring their pitch so it's clear and has a lot of impact?
I don't think I have anything like magical that's not said everywhere, which is kind of like each slide should just be trying to get across one key point. Like, I think where people go wrong, and sometimes people have sent me decks to look at, is there's just so much information on it. Like, I guess similar to when you're doing like a sales email, these people have such limited time to look at it that it needs to be like one clear takeaway on each page. And I would order it based on what you think is the real selling point. So I think if I look back on ours, I think traction should have come up earlier than it did because I think that was the most important thing for us. So yeah.
Did you have a part of your pitch deck that was initially the weakest and like how did you guys go about improving that?
I think traction. And I think the reality was we were doing it like alongside our jobs. So it wasn't like we had all the time in the world so our, when we pitched was probably quite far apart, which did also mean, when we first went out to pitch, they were like, what customers do you have? Whereas by the end, we actually had customers and, so like our traction really did change. And I think that ultimately got us the investment. But I do think pitching early was helpful in that it forced us to go out and sell, which is ultimately what got us the investment.
And is there a part of your pitch you think was particularly strong or persuasive in the end?
I think in the end, it was the fact that we had gone out and sold. I think there's a lot of talk about like having the perfect pitch and perfect narrative. But if you can say, like, I have 10 customers and they are paying me, that clearly shows that like you kind of know what you're doing and that you're serious. And I think the other risk, if you do it the other way around, is I know lots of founders who have actually been really successful in raising money and then they've never sold their product and then they have to go out and sell it and then they've got all of this pressure from investors to sell stuff and they're unable to do so, whereas they could have got to that answer probably a lot quicker if they had actually like sold whilst they were raising as well.
Maybe diving in a little more on that, do you have any advice? I think there's some points where founders are kind of like in between the stages of traction, like they're not pre-traction and they're not at the level where it's kind of easy to just bring it to investors. How do you kind of take the momentum that you have and frame it in a way that like highlights it for investors when maybe it's not 100% closed
Yeah.
customers or something?
Ours, I mean, we had like interested signups and stuff like that. So we definitely did a bit of that. Um, we I'm trying to think back. So we definitely didn't have like loads of customers, but we definitely had interested ones that we had spoken to. We kind of had like a stacking of what they were. So there were kind of like interested ones that had spoken to us, ones that had made purchase, and ones that were subscribed. So even though the subscription base was probably quite small, it was kind of implied that, like we had spoken to these people and these people would be interested in it. I would also say like the best is the enemy of the good. Like we had a website on Squarespace and it was like a booking website and someone would make a booking and it would just email us and we would call up and make the booking, like, but it still meant that we had, subscribing customers. So I think there is an element of um that does show that they were willing to pay for it. It didn't show that our product worked, but I guess that's what we were raising money to build. And there are other ways of showing traction as well. So yeah, like actual traffic to the website and all of that type of thing. I think they want to show that you are going to go out and do the thing that you've said that you're going to do. So also saying, we did this quarter, we did this quarter, and actually like showing. I guess the other one for us was also onboarding venues. So we could kind of be like, oh, we had venues, this many venues, we had this many customers, and you could kind of see that there was growth going on. So
Awesome. Can you talk a bit more about when you had that traction and the investor conversations were going well, how you took that interest from investors and converted it into actual funding?
I think it all goes quite quickly when they are properly interested. So the actual investors that we got, um, it wasn't like this long process. It was kind of like these are the dates, and everyone was kind of bought in, and that followed quite quickly. So I feel like it's the ones that waste loads of your time kind of acting semi-interested and not saying no, like unless they're acting really interested and they're like saying yes to your timeline that you propose, then they're probably not that interested. So I think, yeah, it's the, I think if they're not responding to you and they're being a bit weird, then it probably just means they're actually not interested.
And do you have advice for founders around managing that? Like when is it kind of not worth your time to be engaging with people? Are there kind of questions that you can ask investors to validate whether they're really on board?
I think unless they're talking about check size, like they're probably not on board. So unless like there's a number being touted about, and yeah, then I would kind of assume that they are not interested. Um, I don't feel like we had, and maybe we were lucky in this, but I feel like we didn't have a lot of people that were kind of wasting our time. We maybe had a couple actually in hindsight, but yeah, I feel like often the ones that waste your time are the ones that are not talking a serious amount of money anyway, so um just kind of move on. I think you can normally tell a time waster because they don't tell you the pound figure for ages, and then when you get the pound figure it's like £5,000 and you're like, okay, well, um let's end the conversation there. But yeah, I think just try and get a pound amount. If they say that they're interested, say like what check size are you willing to commit, and if they're not willing to give you a number quite quickly, then they're probably not worth you spending lots of time on.
Awesome. And would love just to get an idea of like what your process looked like. How many investors did you talk to? How many were warm intros versus just cold outreach and how you guys navigated that?
I So the advice I got, which I think is good advice, is go for ones that you don't care about first. And that helps you build up those questions and kind of like work out your pitch and get some answers. I would also say that in doing that, if you're going for the worst ones first, don't take everything, take what they say with a pinch of salt. Like you don't want to change your whole pitch because someone that you don't even think is a good match for you doesn't want to invest in you, because that would be silly. But yeah, I would definitely say go for kind of these ones, the type of people, to be honest, that are advertising online and like asking for lots of decks in, are the ones that are probably easy to approach. So go through those ones first, um, but appreciate that they're probably not the best investors and that they probably have millions of pitches. So just like take them, I guess, with a bit of a pinch of salt. I think the ones that you are going to get that will be good investors are normally introductions. So, you know, I think that is down to networking, like speak to people you know that are successful and have raised money before and see if they'll introduce you to their angels. I would be careful about it because I get like people just randomly messaging me being like, "Oh, will you introduce me?" And I'm like, I don't know you, I don't know your business. So you have to kind of build up that trust. I would say, you know how they say if you want money, go for advice. I would say that that is true. So if you speak to a lot of the introductions that we got were from other founders, and it was because we went to them for advice on our pitch deck, and that's how they introduced us. Um, because you've got to also remember that their investors have a limited pool of money. So by investing in you, they're probably not giving this other startup more of their money. And also, the founder doesn't want to look bad because they encourage their investors to invest in something that isn't good. So it isn't just a really simple introduction. I think like just be like careful and thankful and make sure that you're kind of approaching it in a way that, yeah, that they can kind of get on board with your startup before you ask for something.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that asking for advice before the introduction. That's great.
Yeah.
Is there a time when you received tough feedback from an investor that, shaped your narrative in any way?
I think the toughest stuff we got was early on, which was like, who are your customers? Like, who have you got signed up? And I remember them like really picking through the numbers of there was like a startup competitor that was on one of those crowdfunding platforms. They obviously had all of their deck and all of their finances and everything up, and just going through that, being like, "Do you have more than them? Do you have more than this?" And I was just like, "Jesus!" So like, we definitely, but I think it was good in that it was really early, so it really gave us a kick up the arse to be like, actually, we do need to like be further ahead than we are if we're going to do this. So I think it was hard feedback, but I think the hard feedback is probably the good feedback in that um, it pushed us to, yeah, be like, okay, we need to beat all of these numbers, if that makes sense.
Definitely. And how did you and your co-founder kind of like keep up the momentum and the positive energy during that time?
I think I think so much of being a founder is about resilience. So yeah, you're going to have to go out and sell to people if you're like B2B, and it's all going to be about like you're going to get so many no's versus the number of yeses. So I do think, treat it like a sales process, like how many reach outs you've done, like what status they are, just like treat it as a numbers game, and try not to take things personally. um yeah.
Awesome. And I think a good one is, it's not like you were in the prop tech space or the co-working space before. How did you kind of like build your credibility in that space with your co-founder when you entered into that with Tally?
So it's interesting. When one of our lead investors, I had lunch with him the other day, and he said the reason he invested in us was not because of like our pitch or anything at all. It was literally because he thought Jules could sell anything. And he was like, and it was clear that you could run a business. So I knew that you were going to achieve something. So I think it's quite easy to get like dragged into like, oh, I'm missing this or I'm missing that. Um, and realistically, you can hire for knowledge or you can hire for a skill. Um, so they really need to have faith that you're going to go out and deliver what you say you're going to deliver. So I think a lot more of it is about building that confidence, and I think you can do that in different ways. So I think the way that we did it was actually going out and selling our product and being like, okay, look, we've got customers, but I think depending on your skills, you can do different things. And it also depends on the investors. Like his thesis is I invest in people, not in the idea. So that's why he liked us. But um,
Yeah, definitely. And do you have any just general advice for founders that are going out to fundraise now?
I think, yeah, I think don't take things personally. Like you are going to get hard feedback, but like, you know, uh, that's just the reality of it. I would say sell as early as you can. Um, like you can do as many user interviews and everyone is going to say that they're going to use your product, but like unless they're actually willing to pay for it, then you might have problems further down, and you're actually better off finding that out before you've raised loads of money and you have loads of pressure from investors. So even if you're not trying to get loads of traction, get enough that you are really confident that someone is going to buy this, and do that as early as you can. And I think especially with like AI, where you can literally mock up a fake website, like there's no reason why you can't do that really early. Like you really need to have confidence that people are going to pay for stuff. Yeah. And I get a lot of pushback from founders that I speak to that are like, oh, but this and this. And I'm like, you can interview as many people as you like, and you can have the perfect pitch deck, and you might raise money off that, but you'll still have problems further down the line if you can't sell.
Awesome. Thank you. I think Em has a few questions that she wanted to jump in with too.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Laura. You shared a lot of really interesting insights. I wanted to chat a little bit about exactly what you were just saying and like trying to sell as early as possible. And sorry, I did have to step out for like 2 minutes, so I don't know if you covered that in those 2 minutes. But is there anything you can share around like how you got your first customer, what Tally looked like at that point, and like I guess for founders looking for that first customer, what advice would you have?
So our first customer was someone that I knew that ran a startup. So, would they have done it if they kind of weren't friendly with us? Probably not. But they still ran a company and they were still willing to pay for it with their company's money. So yeah, look for friendly faces and people that you kind of know, and hopefully someone will be kind to you. um, our first product was literally, it was a Squarespace website with a bunch of venues on it, and you could make a booking. And all that would happen was it would ping me and Jules an email, and then we would call up and make the booking. But to the user, it looked like when they made the booking on the website, it just happened. That wasn't the reality of it. We were kind of running around in the background making the bookings. So it was super, super basic. So yeah, and that is kind of like what we sold. And I think we had only sold to like 10 companies maybe when we started. It's not like loads, but enough to show that there were companies out there willing to pay for it.
And what about finding your first customer who didn't come from your network, like someone coming across your website cold and making a booking?
Uh, don't think that happened for a long time. So a lot of our first customers were cold outreach.
Ah,
And so I guess we did two kind of things. We did a lot of customer interviews, and in that kind of customer interview, like at the end, we were like, oh, if you ever want to use it, and like shared it with them. So we kind of did the customer interview, and people were quite willing to do that. But yeah, we would kind of like offer it at the end, and like some people took us up on that. So yeah, I guess the similar like ask for advice and then
yeah,
hopefully get a sale or some money at the end.
that makes sense.
um, yeah.
In terms of that pot on like ask for advice and get funding, one thing that we've seen work and be effective for founders is if they were previously like in a corporate job where they're creating a product that is used in like larger enterprise or corporates, is looking for people on LinkedIn who are like high up in those companies and just reaching out to them. And the chances are if they're high up in a large corporation and they've been there for a while, they probably have the disposable income to angel invest too. So like you can specifically like target, people for that. I'm just sharing that for our founders in the cohort from what we've seen be effective before. And in terms of like your first investor outreach messages, what were the insights that you had that like helped you change that message? Or like did you end up changing it? How did that change over time?
Ours were, I think pretty much everything we did was via introductions. Um, I think Jules possibly sent some cold emails, but I don't think we had any luck with that whatsoever. So I think ours were all introductions. And I don't think they changed hugely, to be honest, like the wording or anything of them. I think it mainly came, the success of them was who was introducing them and them doing it with a bit of confidence. And I think most of that came from, we had those people had given us advice on how to pitch, and then we had kind of updated them on how things were going, and then eventually they had introduced us. So I would say we played a bit of a slow long game, but yeah.
I know that in over the past couple of years, there's been like a number of companies that are either in like the hot desking space and helping people find day passes or workspace, or then you have the like the Hubbles, which is finding offices for teams. What do you think made Tally stand out to investors who were possibly seeing decks of startups doing something similar?
I think I think that's the advantage of family offices and angels, as they've seen a few last days. I honestly think our space was so competitive at the time, um, that like looking back on it, like I'm surprised that we got investors, because some of the bigger ones that we spoke to, they were just like, we've received like 20 desks like
Mm.
this, we're not even going to talk to you. So I don't think we knew quite how competitive it was until we were further in. Just because lots of those were in the same position as us, like they hadn't got websites and all of that type of stuff, so it wasn't like they were findable online. um we I think how we pitched it at the time was that we were focused on companies and we were focused on like flexible workspace, but like as time has come, as like moved on, we're much more similar to Hubble. So yeah, I think you are always going to be competing against someone. So I think it's naive to be like, oh, there are no competitors in this space. It's more about like, you know, actually it's all about like what you do and how you do it, and showing that you have done that and you've delivered on what you've said you're going to done is like what builds the trust, I think. Um,
And just FYI, founders, we'll move to Q&A shortly, so please raise your hand or put something in the comments if you have a question. I know Kathy had a question, but I can't see her on the call now, so she may have had to drop off. But Laura, so just going back to what you said is like, telling founders or sorry, telling investors what you're going to do and then showing them as you deliver on that promise. So were you sending monthly updates to investors from when first spoke to them to when they closed the check to afterwards? Or like what did that update process look like?
no, we weren't. But I think the ones that were interested. So, for example, we had someone that was like, I would be interested in doing a 25K check when you've got like the rest of it covered, if that makes sense. And that type of person, then we could kind of be like, okay, now we've got like 100K committed, and this is FYI, like this is what we've done. So we weren't doing like regular monthly updates, I would say, but we were trying to make sure that the emails like evidence that we were moving everything forward as we said that we didn't want them to have doubts that, things were getting off track, if that makes sense. Um,
And then because your business is obviously like a marketplace business, and so there's so many like challenges and opportunities that come with that. I think especially like as a startup, right? You have to grow like through two different customer bases. How did you divide that amongst like you and Julie at the beginning, and what were, I guess, your thoughts around like which side of the business was more important?
the and I think this is because my previous job was a marketplace as well. There is normally one side of the business that is much harder to acquire than the others. And I would say that the investors wouldn't necessarily be aware of that. For us, it was much harder to acquire paying customers, and probably, as you say, because like it was a competitive space. Whereas on the property side, they're much easier to acquire because like there's no loss to them. They just, they get a fee if
Yeah.
something happens. So for us, it was easier to show traction on the venue side of it, um, even though that was probably like, actually not, yeah, it wasn't that difficult, if that makes sense. But that was quite a good one because we kind of knew if we did this level of outreach, we could acquire this many venues. And if we kept on doing that, then like we were showing growth, if that makes sense. Whereas the customer side was definitely harder, partly because we also didn't have the venue network. Like, why would you want to sign up to a platform with no venues on it?
That makes sense. And then, so I know you said that you've shifted kind of more from just doing like the hot desking to functioning a bit more like Hubble and like office space. Um, I can imagine when you're focusing on the hot desking bit, like you have so many opportunities, like to expand geographically, to expand to focus on larger teams. How did you think about that and prioritize your roadmap?
From working marketplaces, I've always done it on a kind of like area by area, because if you acquire a venue and you have no users going to that venue, then the venue is unhappy. So like we would onboard a customer. So we are B2B, so it would always be like a company. We'd be like, where do your employees live? And like, where do they want to work? And then we would acquire venues in line with that, so that we kind of knew that all of the venues would be getting at least like some level of
Okay.
bookings. And so we kind of did it that way. Because the customers were harder to acquire than the venues, it also meant that like, you know, it felt like we were doing a good job for the customers, because it would be like we could go really hard on acquiring the venues once they had come on board, and it like looked like more of an onboarding process, and quite bespoke to them. So that worked quite well for us.
How do you,
वो एक्सपेंड कर रहे हो क्या?
oh, sorry, Deb, do you have a question? Deb, do you have a question? I can't tell if you accidentally took yourself off mute.
Am I-
Sorry, are you at, maybe not. Okay. Deb, if you do have a question, feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand and we can call on you now. How do you think about like controlling the user experience when, okay, you have like a founder or member who books with you and then they're going into a totally different workspace. So if whether or not they have a great experience or negative experience is very much down to how that co-working space works. So I guess like how do you manage their experience with Tally, and then like is that, I guess like what's the line between that and the co-working space's responsibilities?
So we kick venues off if they don't behave themselves, I think is the fundamental thing. So,
Mhm.
you know, if we keep on getting bad feedback, then we do just remove venues because it doesn't make sense for us. I think there's also like a real they're trying to make it clear throughout the booking process that they are going somewhere else. Like, I think if you're booking through booking.com, you know that they don't own the whole hotel. You still get annoyed with booking.com. Like, that's just the reality of the business we're in. But I think letting them review the venue and all of that type of thing. So as we built out the platform now, customers leave reviews and like, reality is if they have a single review saying the Wi-Fi is not good, no one's ever going to book there. So
Yeah.
um, yeah, so I think it's kind of like similar to other booking websites in that we try to give that transparency that it's not us, try to let them review. And also we just deal with stuff quickly. Like I think the reality is as a startup is like you just have to do like a really high level of customer service that they're not going to get with a bigger provider. So yeah, just having like someone in the UK that is 100% like looking after those bookings like really made a difference.
Is there any sort of challenges around making sure that users stick with you versus, okay, let's say they like really enjoy walking out of, I don't know, Runway East or somewhere that offers like workspace, either fixed desks or like a day pass. Like, how do you make sure that they continue booking through you versus moving directly to booking via the specific co-working space?
I think like we are always going to lose customers to that. But they are supposed to pay us a referral fee. Very hard to make them do that. In our terms though, but it's very hard to like trace, especially if
Yeah.
it's like a small company. I think the reality is their customer service for this type of thing is so much worse than ours that like
Hmm.
most people do come back to us because like honestly if you try and book directly with some of the offices it's just a nightmare. So I think the reality is that our platform is easier, like you get good customer service. And I think actually especially companies of a bigger size, like they just want the convenience and like the quality and to not spend an hour making meeting room booking is just the reality of it. So
That
yeah,
makes
that's
sense.
kind of how we've kept customers, I think, is through that.
And then I know you touched a little bit about this on this earlier, but like, what were the most important metrics for you to track in, I guess, for the eyes of investors? Like, what were the metrics that they were most um, interested in or convinced by, versus what were the most important business metrics for you to track, like purely as a business? Like, what was your North Star metric?
So for us, our North Star was like bums on seats because we felt that if people were actually like in venues making use of our product, then they were having then that was like usage really. I would say like obviously it depends on the type of investors that you're going for, but when you're looking at kind of like angels and family offices who are just looking to make back their money, like it was just revenue. Like yeah.
Yeah.
To be like very
And
boring
then
about it, but that was just the type of
not
investors.
not to get too, sorry if it's not feels like we're getting too granular on this, but we had one thing that we spoke on a lot in an earlier cohort was like once you figure out your North Star metrics, like as you said, like getting bums on seat, it's like what's the exact customer experience that will produce that? Like what can you do? What do you do in order to get that person on the seat, which then drives the revenue? But is there anything in terms of user behavior that you were looking at to figure out like who are actually going to be people who are going to book and then show up, and like how can you create nudges in order to drive that?
Yeah. So I think ours was interesting in that, you know, if when people were booking local workspace, um, it was making sure that they had a good workspace near them, then they would regularly use it. And I think that, to your point earlier about defensibility and people like not going direct, I think the whole point at that point was, your company was paying for you to go somewhere local. So we were also handling like all of the admin of that.
Mm.
As things changed and people started using us to book like central London offices, we found it much harder to increase the number that they booked because they were just booking to meet up on a Wednesday. And there wasn't really a lot we could do to like increase that further. What was interesting and like how the business changed was like we realized that once they started like booking over a certain point, then it obviously made sense for them to get a full-time office. And it was being really aware at like what that trigger point was and making sure that they used us to get the office, because the worst thing that could happen is, you know, we'd spent ages really like hand-holding and looking after this customer. COVID ended, they started like booking twice a week, and then like it went to zero quite quickly. So we just really had to be on top of our customers and making sure that they kind of moved from hot desk to office by the day to office with us. So ours is a bit of a weird journey in that like it's kind of more about like making sure that they go to the next product, they're aware of the next product, and what the trigger points are. Yeah.
Sense. I have some more questions around cold outreach, but I know Michaela has some questions, so I'll hand it back to her. And then founders, remember, if you have a question, raise your hand or put it in the chat.
Awesome. Yeah, I think I'd love to go back. You touched on this a little bit with kind of like the projections and how they were different for a VC style investor versus angels, but would just love to think about how you guys positioned yourself in terms of like market share, who you were competing against, and like what was your story to investors? Were you going to be the next big thing, or were you clear about, you know, capturing a certain space?
The market looked really, really big because we were kind of saying, you know, people aren't going to use offices in quite the same way. They're going to use more flexible workspace. The market size was big. We were saying that we were going after like B2B, especially the startup scale up space. So that was this big. So I think there was a narrative that, you know, like if even if we are this percentage of the market, we will still be this large. I think because it was such a competitive market, I don't think we ever said we were going to be the only one. But it was kind of like, you know, Desana are going after large corporates. We're going after startups and scale ups. Like Hubble probably was the only one that was really like going after that same space. And then there were other ones that were going after like freelancers and stuff. And we just said, we're not touching that side of the market. So it was kind of clear, yeah, which bit of the market and like how big that was, I think. Yeah.
And would love to hear a little about like so much of it is impacted by, you know, the change and shift in working styles and in the pandemic and things like that. How does just like seasonality, market conditions, news, how did that impact Tally, and how do you think founders should take that on with everything going on now?
I think you've just got to be prepared to change. Like when we were like hot desks and on demand and meeting rooms, there was just, I remember like this really brutal day where me and Jules were like, because we'd lost like another customer to like going to a full-time office. And originally what we were doing, we were giving them two other like office brokers, and we could see what they were getting back, if that makes sense. We were like, actually, we could do this better than them and we need to do this ourselves. But it was like, it really felt gutting because it was like we put so much work into building up this platform, and it was kind of admitting like this wasn't going to be the next big thing and that we were going to have to do something else. So like, I think it is just hard and you have to make difficult decisions sometimes. But yeah, the market is going to be changed. And I think trying to back a horse that is quite clearly no longer a thing is more soul destroying. But yeah, I think you've just got to like look at the numbers and sometimes make a difficult decision, I think.
Awesome. And would love to hear more about, you mentioned you were kind of doing this on the side of your jobs in the beginning. Like when did you make the shift to full-time?
So the reason we went out to hire to raise money was our developer Michelle, who I used to work with. She was working somewhere and she had done some like part-time days for us. But she was like, I'm gonna go and get another job, if that makes sense. So we kind of knew we had a timeline to hire her. We knew how hard it was to hire like a good developer. So we were a bit like, we need to raise now. So we raised for that, and then we actually won an Innovate UK grant. And so it was kind of it was the fundraising and the Innovate UK grant that was like, okay, we need to give this like a proper go. Before those two things, we were just kind of doing it on the side. So those were kind of like the trigger points for us, I think. Yeah, because we were going to have a full-time employee without either of us working there. And to be honest, we did have, Jules was part-time and Michelle was full-time, I think for maybe like 4 or 5 months before I even started.
Sorry if this is too, we can either cut this part out of the recording or you don't have to share it, but like, could and you don't have to get into specifics, but in terms of team equity, and like co-founder equity, when, as you mentioned, like they had already been working on the startup for a few months before you, how did that factor into equity split conversations?
I think we have never, so me and Jules are just like 50-50. And I don't think our employees have been as bothered about equity as you would expect. So I think it's more reflected in the salaries that we've paid. So I feel like we've always tried to pay a fair salary, and equity is like a bonus. I think too many people have been like jaded and broken by their equity not doing what they wanted it to do. Yeah. So I don't think it is as big a lever as people think it is. So yeah.
No, that's so important because I've seen so many co-founders who like one person is working on it for 5, 6 months before they bring on another co-founder and they really want that visible in the equity split. And it's like, it's what about you two? It's about what you two are going to build together. And like you don't want to be stingy with co-founder equity. And in the grand scheme of things, someone working on it a few months more is not going to make that big of a difference. You mentioned a little bit about like making a pretty hard decision, and what I'd love to hear, like what's been the hardest decision that you've had to make, and like how have you not been overly romantic like or attached to what you're building and been so adaptable and making changes when you needed to?
I think ours is made easier by, I think I'm like passionate about building things. Not necessarily like, I wasn't necessarily passionate about hot desks, if that makes sense. So I was much more passionate about building something good that people would use, and I get like a satisfaction from that. Whereas I can imagine like that adaptability is harder when you're really focused on something that's going to like change the world or something.
I have a quick question just about, how did you, obviously you mentioned you were friends first and you guys kind of came up with the idea, but how did you kind of validate that you and Jules were the right co-founder match? And like, what skills does she have that you don't have, and vice versa, that make you guys a strong team?
We're so we're really good friends, but when it comes to work, we're so different. Like I am into the finance and the detail, and she's into like the sales so it was like a very good match. But I think we were very lucky in that, because I don't think like we started doing it together because we were friends. We didn't necessarily even realize how different our working styles were until we worked together. And I think you just need to be, in hindsight, I think we were very lucky that we landed with that. But you do need someone that's like willing to do sales and enjoys doing sales and enjoys doing like the outreach and the forward facing. And then you do also need someone that like cares about the financials and the like details. So I think if I was choosing a founder, I would choose Jules. But like obviously that like we were just lucky we were friends.
We're just about at time, so unless anyone has any final questions, we'll wrap it there. Thank you so much for joining us, Laura. We'll link to your LinkedIn and also to Tally too, because there's probably founders on here that would want to use your product. Is there anything else that you want to add?
No, I don't think so. But yeah, if anyone has any questions or anything, feel free to put